Right now, somewhere in the choppy waters of the Arabian Sea, there is this 25-year-old rusting oil tanker.
Oh, absolutely.
And it has no maritime insurance. It's flying a totally fake flag. And the captain is physically flipping a switch to turn off its digital tracking beacon.
Just completely vanishing.
Right, vanishing from global radar. And by flipping that single switch, that ghost ship is fundamentally altering the price of the groceries you're going to buy next week.
It sounds like fiction, but it's exactly how the global economy is functioning right now.
It really is. So today, we're looking at how invisible systems, from these stateless ships dodging international law to, microscopic sensors suspended inside a World Cup football, how these systems are secretly running the world. Welcome to the Daily Deep Dive 3D initiative of UPSC with Saurabh Kaushik.
Thanks for having me. It is a really profound shift in perspective when you stop looking at the daily news updates as just, isolated events.
Yeah, totally.
Because we have 8 highly distinct topics on the table today. We're spanning everything from the macroeconomic data of India to the constitutional limits of state power in West Bengal.
We've got deep flaws in digital education infrastructure all the way to, the artificial intelligence grids of tomorrow.
Right, and the connective tissue binding all of this together is stress. We are basically analyzing how massive entrenched systems, whether they're economic, digital, political, or global, how they behave when they are pushed to their absolute limits.
Or when they're confronted with rapid technological evolution.
Right. Definitely.
And for you listening, navigating that kind of complexity can feel like trying to drink from a fire hose. It's overwhelming.
Without a doubt.
So our mission today is to just cut through that noise. We want to extract the fundamental mechanisms of how these things actually work and give you the competitive edge in understanding today's most crucial developments.
And we are starting right at the top with the macro engine of the country itself.
Let's do it. So the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, MOSPI, they just released the provisional estimates for India's national income for the financial year 2025-26.
Right, the big data dump.
Yeah, and the headline figure here is a real GDP growth of 7.7%.
Which is massive. And to really contextualize that 7.7%, you have to look at the trajectory, right?
Because the previous financial year, FY25, that recorded a growth of 7.1% based on the first revised estimate.
Exactly. So the engine is demonstrably accelerating. We aren't just growing, we're growing faster.
Right.
Furthermore, the 7.7% figure actually surpasses the government's own second advance estimate. That was published back in February, and they projected 7.6%.
So we beat our own estimates. And the absolute numbers are staggering when you lay them out. Real GDP at constant prices hit, 323.12 lakh crore rupees?
Yep. And nominal GDP grew by 8.9%, reaching 346.36 lakh crore rupees.
Okay, but let's just pause on the methodology here for a second, because the terminology can get incredibly dense for anyone, not staring at spreadsheets all day.
Oh, it's a total alphabet soup.
Right. We constantly hear about advanced estimates, then revised estimates, and now we're talking about these provisional estimates.
Yeah, it's a lot.
To a casual observer, it might look like the statistical authorities are just constantly moving the goalposts, sort of like correcting their own math every few months. Why do we have this multi-tiered release system?
Well, the multi-tiered system is basically a necessity born of scale and data latency.
How so?
You have to remember that an economy of 1.4 billion people with massive informal sectors, complex supply chains, millions of enterprises, it does not simply print out a neat, consolidated receipt at midnight on March 31st.
Right. That makes sense. It takes time to count everything.
Exactly. So those advanced estimates you hear about early on, they rely heavily on extrapolation and whatever high-frequency indicators are available early in the year.
Just educated guesses, basically.
Highly educated, but yes, projections. By the time we reach the provisional estimate, which is the data point we are analyzing today, MOSPI finally has access to complete full-year annual data that was previously unavailable to them.
Okay, so they're finally looking at the full 12 months of the Index of Industrial Production, the IIP.
Yes, and they have the final audited financial results of major corporations. They have the complete balance of payments data from the central bank, full-year price indices, all of it.
So the picture is just much clearer.
Precisely. MOSPI utilizes a benchmark indicator methodology. They take specific sector-level indicators, for instance, taking the full year of central GST collections to gauge the health of the services sector, and they weight those indicators by their relative contribution to the total value added in the economy.
It's a process of the picture coming into sharper and sharper focus as the raw data physically arrives at the statistical offices.
You nailed it.
Which brings us to another metric in the report that I think requires some unpacking. GVA, or gross value added?
Ah, yes. The classic stumbling block.
Right, so the data shows that GVA grew by 7.9%. So we have GDP growing at 7.7%, but GVA growing slightly faster at 7.9%.
Yeah, and for anyone trying to build a solid foundational understanding of macroeconomics, the distinction between these two acronyms is so important.
Because they sound like they should be the exact same thing.
They do, but they're critical distinctions because they measure economic health from two slightly different vantage points.
Okay, break it down for us.
Sure. So gross value added is the most granular measure of pure economic activity at the sector level. It calculates the total value of all goods and services produced in a specific sector, and then it explicitly subtracts the cost of all the intermediate inputs and raw materials that went into producing them.
Oh, okay. So it tells you exactly how much actual new value a sector added to the economy.
Precisely. Now, GDP, conversely, is GVA plus the net taxes on products.
Net taxes, meaning all the indirect taxes collected by the government, minus all the subsidies paid out by the government?
Right. So if GVA growth is outpacing GDP growth, as we see here with the 7.9 versus 7.7%.
It indicates a shift in that net tax component, right? Like,
yeah.
Perhaps the government paid out higher subsidies over the year, or indirect tax collections grew at a slower pace relative to the raw output of the factories and services.
That is the mechanical reality of the formula, yes. And when you look at where this GVA is actually originating, the tertiary sector, the services sector, remains the absolute dominant force in the Indian economy. We
are talking about trade, hospitality, transport, communication, financial services, real estate.
Exactly. Services currently account for roughly 55% of India's total GDP.
Wow, over half.
Easily. And the high-frequency indicators validate this dominance. Annual CGST collections are up 6.4%, vehicle registrations are soaring, domestic air traffic is literally breaking records, and port cargo volumes are humming.
Yet, when you read through the breakdown, the manufacturing sector is demonstrating serious momentum too, right? It isn't just a services story anymore.
No, it's not. The manufacturing growth signifies a really vital structural evolution. We are witnessing robust expansion heavily driven by sustained capital expenditure under the Make in India initiative.
And specifically the domestic defense procurement push, right? Under Operation Sindoor.
Yes, heavy industries are scaling up fast. Agriculture, meanwhile, demonstrated modest but stable growth.
Because they benefited from a near-normal southwest monsoon in the previous cycle.
Right, which allowed for steady outputs in both the Kharif, the monsoon sown crops, and the Rabi, the winter sown crops.
Okay, let's isolate the final quarter of this data set because I think the timeline here is deeply significant.
Q4.
Right, Q4 of FY26 covers January, February, and March of 2026. And real GDP in that specific three-month window grew by a very strong 7.8%.
It did.
But anyone following global geopolitics knows that March 2026 is when the global board was violently flipped.
Exactly. The Q4 data contains a massive geopolitical lag.
Because the major hostilities in the U.S.-Israel-Iran war commenced on February 28, 2026.
Right. So this means the 7.8% growth captured in Q4 essentially reflects a normal January, a normal February, and only one single month of the ensuing chaos.
March is when the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed to conventional shipping. Global supply chains began to fracture, and the spot price of crude oil spiked dramatically.
Yeah, so that robust Q4 number is essentially insulated from the worst of that shock.
The true macroeconomic reckoning of the Hormuz closure is going to materialize in the Q1 FY27 data, isn't it?
Without a doubt. The chief economic advisor, V. Anantha Nageswaran, he characterized this 7.7% annual figure as a balanced picture of the economy's components.
Right.
However, he also acknowledged that the Reserve Bank of India's somewhat more conservative projections for the upcoming financial year are, frankly, entirely reasonable given the horizon.
Because economists across the board are forecasting a deceleration for FY27 due to three converging headwinds.
Let's hear.
First, the sustained elevation of oil import costs due to the West Asia conflict. Second, the meteorological forecast predicting a below-normal monsoon, which is currently sitting at around 90% of the long-period average.
Which poses a severe threat to rural consumption patterns and agricultural yields.
Right. And third, the looming specter of unpredictable U.S. tariff policies on Indian exports.
Those headwinds clearly delineate the boundary between internal economic momentum and external vulnerability.
Yeah.
I mean, the 7.7% growth is a testament to the strength of India's internal digital and physical infrastructure. But an economy reliant on imported energy and seasonal rainfall remains exposed to shocks that cannot be engineered away by domestic policy.
Before we transition away from the macro data, there's one more vital concept in the MOSPI report I want to touch on, the GDP deflator.
Ah, yes.
So the data shows nominal GDP grew by 8.9%, while real GDP grew by 7.7%. That leaves a gap of 1.2%.
Right, the deflator gap.
I always find a helpful way to visualize this for you guys listening is to imagine stepping onto a bathroom scale while holding heavy bags of groceries.
Okay, I like this analogy.
So the groceries represent inflation. Your nominal GDP is the total weight on the scale U plus the groceries.
Right.
Your real GDP is what you weigh after you put the groceries down. So the GDP deflator is basically the scale calculating the exact isolated weight of those groceries, stripping out the price rises to show the actual increase in physical production.
That's a great way to put it. And to stretch your grocery analogy further, the deflator isn't just looking at the retail groceries you bought today.
It's broader than that.
Much broader. It is an implicit price index that covers the entire breadth of the economy. Unlike the consumer price index, the CPI, which only tracks specific basket of retail goods, the GDP deflator includes the changing costs of the truck that delivered those groceries.
Oh, wow.
It includes the factory machinery that packaged them, the steel used to build the factory, everything. So a deflator gap of just 1.2% tells us that across the entire spectrum of Indian economic production, aggregate price rises were remarkably subdued last year.
Okay, so we have this picture of a resilient 7.7% growth economy, heavily reliant on modernization, and this massive push toward digital public infrastructure.
Yes.
But the very digital infrastructure facilitating this modern economy has a profoundly fragile underbelly.
Yeah.
And in the education sector, it took a 19-year-old student to expose just how deep that fragility goes.
Yeah. The cybersecurity failure at the Central Board of Secondary Education, the CBSE, is a textbook case study in systemic negligence.
It's unbelievable.
It really highlights the perilous gap between the ambition of digitizing public services and the reality of actually securing them.
The timeline of this breach is honestly infuriating. So in February 2026, a 19-year-old Class 12 student named Nisarga Adhikari, who is a self-taught cybersecurity researcher, begins probing the CBSE's on-screen marking portal, the OSM.
Right. And this portal is the digital backbone of the evaluation process. It's built and managed by a third-party vendor from Hyderabad named govt Edutech.
So Adhikari discovers catastrophic security flaws. And he follows the established protocols of ethical hacking. He doesn't go to the press. He privately details these vulnerabilities in reports sent to both the CBSE and CERT-IN, the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team.
He did everything right. He gave them the standard window to patch the system.
And what happens?
The institutional response was total silence.
Silence.
The responsible disclosure was completely ignored by the nodal agencies tasked with protecting digital infrastructure.
Fast forward to late May 2026. The Class 12 results are published, and the pass percentage plummets to 85.2%. Which is the lowest it has been since 2019.
Right.
Panic naturally ensues among students and parents with widespread allegations of evaluation errors. And it is only at this breaking point that Adhikari decides to go public with his February findings to explain what might have happened to the system.
And the technical nature of the vulnerabilities he exposed is what makes this so egregious. I mean, this was not a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored cyber attack utilizing zero-day exploits.
It wasn't some elite hacker syndicate.
No. The flaws were the result of gross incompetence in basic software development and cloud architecture.
Yeah, he found a hard-coded master password sitting openly in the publicly accessible JavaScript code of the portal. Any browser loading the page basically downloaded the password.
That's cybersecurity 101.
Exactly. He found one-time passwords, OTPs, meant for two-factor authentication, plainly visible in the source code. He demonstrated the ability to arbitrarily reset any examiner's password without triggering any secondary verification.
But the most devastating discovery was an improperly configured Amazon Web Services S3 bucket.
Can you explain that for the listeners? What is an S3 bucket?
Sure. The AWS S3 bucket misconfiguration is basically the cardinal sin of cloud security. An S3 bucket is essentially a scalable object storage service in the clouds where you dump massive amounts of data.
Well,
Leaving it public without proper access control lists or ACLs is not just like leaving a filing cabinet open on a sidewalk. It is like constructing a massive public library to house the most sensitive data of millions of teenagers, leaving the front doors off the hinges and abandoning the circulation desk.
and crucially, Adhikari claimed he didn't just have read access to this library, he had write access,
Exactly.
meaning he could theoretically walk in, take the master blueprints, alter the records, upload malicious files, or rewrite the grades entirely.
Yes, standard cloud security architecture demands that buckets holding personally identifiable information must have private ACLs, they must enforce encryption at rest, and they must maintain rigorous access logging to track every single IP address that touches the data.
And COAMT Edutech failed to implement
They
that.
failed to implement the most basic guardrails provided natively by Amazon Web Services. Furthermore, this single unsecured bucket was allegedly being shared across multiple different educational institutions that utilized COAMT services.
So it created a massive single point of failure.
Ex-
And what's wild is the CBSE's initial reaction was denial. From June 3rd to June 5th, they issued statements categorically denying that any security breaches had compromised the evaluation process.
They dug their heels in.
They only reversed course and admitted the vulnerabilities after two separate independent hacking groups publicly confirmed Adhikari's findings by penetrating the live system.
It escalated so quickly that the Union Education Minister, Dharmendra Pradhan, had to personally intervene. He deployed specialized cybersecurity teams from IIT Madras and IIT Kanpur just to urgently lock down the servers.
This situation really illuminates the severe legal and operational risks faced by ethical hackers in India, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Adhikari operated as a white hat, probing systems to identify vulnerabilities before malicious actors could exploit them. He adhered to coordinated vulnerability disclosure norms.
Yet under India's Information Technology Act of 2008, accessing a computer resource without explicit authorization, regardless of intent, is a criminal offense.
Right. He was taking a huge personal risk.
This is where the national strategy seems entirely contradictory to me. We hear so much about digital India, and we are aggressively pushing this narrative, migrating massive amounts of citizen data onto government platforms.
Yeah.
But if we don't have formal bug bounty programs like tech giants do, or even like the U.S. government has, aren't we basically punishing the good guys who find the open doors while leaving the doors wide open for the bad guys?
That's exactly what we're doing. The absence of institutionalized bug bounty programs in the public sector creates a massive chilling effect on cybersecurity research.
Because who wants to go to jail for helping?
Right, and this is further complicated by the stringent requirements of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the DPDP Act of 2023. Under this legislation, the scanned answer sheets, the students' marks, and the personal details of the evaluators are strictly defined as personal data.
Which legally designates the CBSE and their vendor, COAMT Edutech, as data fiduciaries.
And as data fiduciaries, Section 8 of the DPDP Act legally obligates them to implement reasonable security safeguards to prevent personal data breaches. Section 6 imposes strict obligations regarding consent and notification in the event of a breach.
So exposing an S3 bucket with write access is a catastrophic violation of those statutory duties.
It really is, and it demands a severe reckoning regarding the public procurement process.
How did they even get this contract?
Oh, COAMT Edutech was awarded this contract for 384.6 crore rupees, significantly underbidding established players like TCS ION, whose proposal was valued at over 950 crore rupees.
Wow. So they went with the lowest bidder.
The government opted for the lowest bidder, citing their experience. But a procurement framework that fails to mandate and independently audit basic cloud security hygiene before entrusting a vendor with the biometric and academic data of millions is fundamentally broken.
It is a profound institutional failure to prioritize cost over security and to respond to responsible disclosure with silence and eventual denial.
Agree.
But speaking of entrenched systemic flaws and the absolute breakdown of institutional accountability, we have a mandate to turn our attention to the state of West Bengal.
Yes. The transition from a crisis of digital infrastructure to a crisis of political and constitutional infrastructure is a stark one.
It is. Now, as we look at the editorial assessment published in the Hindu regarding West Bengal, we are entering highly charged territory. And before we even unpack this, I must make it absolutely clear to everyone listening. The insights we are about to discuss come directly from the Hindu's editorial assessment.
Important caveat.
Right. We are impartially reporting the contents of this source material, and we are not taking any political sides or endorsing these viewpoints. We are just dissecting the mechanics of how this editorial claims the political state operates.
Understood. So, the Hindu's editorial provides a grim diagnosis of what it terms West Bengal's entrenched culture of political violence and institutional impunity.
And the immediate catalyst for this analysis was the severe post-election violence that erupted following the by-elections in the Mulda and Murshidabad districts in late May 2026.
Yes. The aftermath of those by-elections saw targeted violence against opposition political workers across the spectrum, affecting the BJP, the Congress, and the left.
Homes were destroyed, individuals were killed, and the situation deteriorated so rapidly that the National Human Rights Commission, the NHRC, formally intervened. They issued notices to the state government demanding accountability.
But the core thesis of the editorial is that treating this as a recent aberration tied solely to the current Trinamool Congress government ignores decades of history.
Right, they say it goes way back.
The historical context is the anchor of their argument. The editorial traces the architectural blueprint of this violent political culture directly back to the Left Front era,
which was an unbroken 34-year period of rule, stretching from 1977 to 2011.
Exactly. The assessment posits that during those decades, a specific, highly effective political machine was constructed. It engineered a political culture where democratic competition is no longer viewed as a periodic electoral contest between differing ideologies, but rather as absolute existential warfare.
Existential warfare implies that losing an election doesn't just relegate you to the opposition benches in the assembly. It means you lose your right to exist safely within your own village. You lose your livelihood.
And the mechanism that enforces this existential threat is what the editorial defines as the party panchayat fusion.
Okay, let's explain that. The Panchayati Raj system in India is designed to be the bedrock of local self-government, right? Empowering villages to manage their own development.
In theory, yes. However, the editorial argues that in Bengal, these local institutions have been so thoroughly captured and penetrated by the ruling party apparatus that they no longer function as independent democratic bodies.
So, if this party panchayat fusion, where the ruling party completely controls jobs, rations, and contracts at the local level, has existed across different ruling parties since 1977, does that mean the political machine in Bengal is technically working exactly as it was designed to, just at the expense of democratic norms?
That is precisely what they are arguing. Think about how that fusion actually works on the ground. A panchayat controls the distribution of rural resources. They manage the funds for the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the NREGA.
They decide who gets housing subsidies under state schemes. They issue local civil contracts for road building.
Right. So if the ruling party completely fuses its own hierarchy with the panchayat administration, then access to basic state resources, rations, daily wage labor, housing becomes entirely contingent on demonstrating absolute loyalty to the party.
The political party effectively becomes the state.
Yes. And the second foundational pillar supporting this machine, according to the editorial, is the party police nexus. The assessment notes a deeply ingrained historical pattern where the state's law enforcement apparatus, from senior IPS officers down to the local constabulary, is systematically pressured to serve the political objectives of the ruling regime.
So successive administrations have weaponized the police force to shield party loyalists and intimidate the opposition.
According to the editorial, yes. And they cite a harrowing timeline of recent events to illustrate how this entrenched impunity manifests today.
They highlight the Sandesh Kali incident spanning from 2023 to 2025, where local strongmen affiliated with the ruling party were accused of systemic sexual violence and massive land grabs.
And operating for years with apparent absolute immunity from the local police.
It points to the West Bengal School Service Commission, the WBSSC scam, which led to the arrest of former Education Minister Partha Chatterjee. That exposed a system where teaching jobs were systematically auctioned off for cash.
And it brings up the horrific R.G. Carr Medical College case from 2024 involving the rape and murder of a trainee doctor,
which ignited massive civil protests amid severe allegations that the state apparatus attempted to tamper with evidence and protect the accused.
When a state's political culture normalizes the subversion of law enforcement and the commodification of public employment, it inevitably triggers cascading constitutional crises. We are observing this friction constantly in West Bengal.
There is perpetual open warfare between the governor of the state, who acts as the constitutional representative of the center, and the elected state government.
Right. The conflict manifests in battles over university vice chancellor appointments, the deliberate withholding of gubernatorial assent to state legislation, and the governor repeatedly sending reports to the Ministry of Home Affairs suggesting that the constitutional machinery of the state is failing.
Which naturally leads to the ultimate constitutional question. If the governor is reporting a breakdown of the machinery, why doesn't the central government invoke Article 356 of the Constitution and impose president's rule?
That's the big question. And the reluctance to invoke Article 356 is anchored in the supreme legal precedent established by the 1994 Bamai judgment.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Prior to 1994, the central government frequently and often arbitrarily dismissed state governments run by opposition parties, citing vague breakdowns of order. The Supreme Court in the S.R. Bamai case fundamentally altered the balance of federal power.
How so?
The court ruled that the imposition of president's rule is subject to judicial review, and crucially, that the only legitimate forum to test whether a state government enjoys a majority is a floor test in the Legislative Assembly, not the subjective opinion of the governor.
So the Bamai judgment set the constitutional bar for intervention astronomically high, specifically to prevent Article 356 from being used as a weapon for political vendetta.
Precisely. The center cannot dismiss a state government simply because the political culture is violent or corrupt. It must prove a complete, paralyzing failure of the constitutional apparatus that cannot be remedied by a floor test.
Consequently, the center's hands are largely tied by this precedent.
Yes. And this forces the Election Commission of India into a massive logistical bind. Because the local state police are perceived as entirely compromised by the party police nexus, the ECI cannot trust them to impartially secure polling booths.
So they are forced to deploy unprecedented numbers of central armed police forces simply to facilitate a basic democratic exercise.
Exactly. As the editorial concludes, when you cannot trust the local constabulary to guard a ballot box without exhibiting partisan bias, the foundational trust required for a functioning democracy is fundamentally fractured.
And this localized political instability generates immense daily insecurity for the citizenry. But if we shift our focus from the localized constitutional crises of a state to the overarching economic stability of the entire nation, we encounter a very different kind of volatility.
Right. Moving from state politics to national economics, we must analyze the latest monetary policy decision from the Reserve Bank of India, specifically the actions of the Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, led by Governor Sanjay Malhotra.
On June 5th, the MPC announced its decision to hold the primary repo rate steady at 5.25%.
Correct.
To lay out the complete dashboard of rates for the listeners, the repo rate, the rate at which the RBI lends short-term funds to commercial banks, remains at 5.25%. The standing deposit facility, the SDF, which absorbs excess liquidity from banks without collateral, is held at 5.0%.
And the marginal standing facility, the MSF, for emergency borrowing is at 5.50%.
So this is the second consecutive bi-monthly meeting where the MPC has maintained this exact structure, holding a neutral policy stance. However, the rates themselves aren't the primary story here, are they?
No, the story is the RBI's drastic revision of their future economic forecasts.
The forecasts paint a highly concerning picture of the macroeconomic horizon. The MPC downgraded their projection for real GDP growth for FY27 from a robust 6.9% down to 6.6%.
Concurrently, they dramatically revised their forecast for retail CPI inflation, projecting it to surge to 5.1%. That is a massive escalation from the 3.5% they had modeled just back in February.
So the economy is decelerating while the cost of living is accelerating.
Yes. In macroeconomic terms, this is the classic definition of stagflation risk.
And that's bad.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario for any central bank, because the traditional tools used to fight one problem actively make the other problem worse.
What is the fundamental mechanism driving this sudden stagflationary pressure?
The pressure is the result of a severe collision between global geopolitics and domestic climatic vulnerabilities. The absolute primary driver of the inflation spike is the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. The geopolitical conflict in West Asia has choked off one of the world's most vital energy arteries.
Exactly, driving the global spot price of crude oil up to between $95 and $100 a barrel.
And India's vulnerability to global oil markets is profound. We import roughly 85% of our total crude oil requirements. When the price of Brent crude surges, it acts as a massive regressive tax on the entire Indian economy.
The transmission mechanism is mathematical. The RBI's internal modeling indicates that for every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of crude oil, India's CPI inflation rises by roughly 20 to 25 basis points.
Wow.
Crucially, this transmission operates with a lag of 2 to 3 months. The supply chain shock that began with Hormuz disruptions in late February and March is only now fully manifesting in the retail prices consumers pay for goods and transportation.
And compounding the energy shock is a severe agricultural threat, right? The meteorological department is forecasting a below-normal monsoon, currently tracking at 90% of the long-period average.
Yes, a deficient monsoon directly threatens the yields of critical food crops. We're already observing the wholesale price index, the WPI, which measures inflation in factory gate, and the wholesale market surging to 8.3%.
While CPI measures what you pay at the store, WPI measures what the retailer pays the distributor.
Exactly. Historically, sustained double-digit WPI inflation inevitably bleeds down into the retail CPI basket. A poor monsoon guarantees that food inflation will remain elevated through the third and fourth quarters of FY27.
Furthermore, we have to examine the currency dynamics, because the exchange rate acts as an amplifier for inflation. The Indian rupee is currently hovering around 95 to 97 against the US dollar.
Which is very weak. A depreciated rupee means that India is actively importing inflation. Because global commodities like oil, electronics, and edible oils are priced in dollars, a weaker rupee requires more domestic currency to purchase the exact same volume of goods.
It exacerbates the imported inflation shock.
It really does.
So if we think about it, the RBI is driving a car where the engine is overheating. That's inflation, right? But the momentum is slowing down. Cutting rates is hitting the gas, raising rates is slamming the brakes. By holding at 5.25%, they've just decided to coast in neutral and pray the road flattens out.
That is a very accurate way to visualize it. The decision to hold preserves policy optionality. A neutral stance allows the central bank to remain nimble.
They are essentially buying time.
Yes, to observe how the monsoon physically materializes across the agricultural heartland, to assess the incoming administration's trade tariff posture in the U.S., and most critically, to see if global oil markets stabilize.
To manage the immediate volatility, the RBI did deploy targeted liquidity measures, though.
They did. They extended the concessional forex swap facility for banks until September 2026. This is a mechanism where the RBI temporarily bears the hedging costs to incentivize foreign portfolio investment and stabilize the rupee.
They also restore the export realization period back to its standard 9 months, removing a temporary relaxation that had been implemented during earlier disruptions.
Right. Governor Malhotra explicitly stated during the press conference that the RBI does not target a specific numerical level for the rupee. Their mandate is strictly to intervene in the forex markets to smooth out excessive disruptive volatility.
However, the root cause of this entire monetary headache remains firmly anchored in the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz has been virtually impassable for standard commercial shipping since February 2026 due to the U.S.-Israel-Iran war.
Yes, conventional oil tanker traffic has collapsed by over 90%.
Which begs a multi-billion-dollar logistical question. If the strait is a war zone, and major maritime insurance conglomerates refuse to cover vessels entering the area, how is millions of barrels of crude oil still managing to exit the Persian Gulf every single day?
Well, the oil is exiting because the entire logistics chain has descended into the shadows.
The shadow fleet.
Exactly. We are witnessing the unprecedented rapid scale-up of what maritime intelligence agencies refer to as the shadow fleet, or occasionally the dark fleet.
It sounds like the plot of a maritime espionage thriller, but this invisible fleet is actively dictating the inflation rate in Mumbai and the monetary policy of the RBI. What exactly constitutes this shadow fleet?
It is a massive, decentralized armada of oil tankers operating entirely outside the boundaries of international maritime law and standard commercial regulation. Current intelligence estimates place the size of this fleet at roughly 978 vessels.
978 vessels.
To put that in perspective, that represents over 18% of the entire global crude oil tanker fleet.
Almost a fifth of all tankers. That's insane.
And these are not state-of-the-art ships. They are typically obsolete vessels, often exceeding 20 years of age, which means they are structurally compromised and highly prone to mechanical failure.
I'm guessing they aren't fully insured either.
Not at all. They operate completely outside the Western maritime insurance markets. They lack standard protection and indemnity, or P&I, club coverage. Their ownership structures are deliberately opaque, buried beneath labyrinthine layers of anonymous shell companies registered across multiple offshore tax havens.
Historically, we saw this fleet expand massively to facilitate the export of Russian crude oil following the sweeping Western sanctions imposed in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine. But since the conflict escalated in March 2026, Iranian shadow tankers have essentially monopolized the transit routes through the Strait of Hormuz. How are these massive, aging ships physically navigating through an active conflict zone?
They employ a repertoire of highly illegal, profoundly dangerous maritime tactics. The foundational tactic is the manipulation of the Automatic Identification System, or AIS.
Explain the AIS for us.
Under international maritime law, all commercial vessels over a certain tonnage are mandated to operate a VHF radio transponder system that constantly broadcasts their identity, their precise GPS location, their course, and their speed.
It's designed to prevent catastrophic collisions at sea.
Exactly. So the Shadow Fleet simply deactivates these transponders. They go dark as they approach the strait, rendering them electronically invisible to standard commercial maritime surveillance platforms and coastal radar networks.
And when going dark isn't sufficient, they utilize AI spoofing, right?
Yes, they manipulate the hardware to broadcast fraudulent GPS coordinates. A ship will transmit data indicating it is safely anchored in a port in Dubai, while physically the massive vessel is navigating directly through the naval crosshairs in the center of the Strait of Hormuz.
The evasion doesn't stop at the transit, though. Once the sanctioned oil clears the strait, it must be laundered into the legitimate global market.
And this is achieved through ship-to-ship, or STS, transfers.
Okay, how does that work?
A sanctioned Iranian shadow tanker will load its cargo, sail out into the deeper waters of the Gulf of Oman or the open Arabian Sea, and physically pull up alongside a clean, non-sanctioned vessel.
In the middle of the ocean.
In the middle of the open ocean, subject to weather and swells, they deploy massive heavy-duty hoses and transfer millions of barrels of crude oil from the dark ship to the clean ship.
This physical transfer completely severs the documentary paper trail. The clean ship, carrying the laundered oil, then sails into a global port with pristine paperwork. Okay, let's unpack flag hopping. If a ship is completely stateless, like the one flying the Guyana flag, without actual registration, who actually enforces the law if it crashes or spills oil? Is the ocean basically the Wild West right now?
It absolutely is. Every commercial ship on the ocean must be registered to a specific country, known as the flag state. The flag state is legally responsible for enforcing environmental and safety regulations on that vessel.
Right.
To evade scrutiny, the Shadow Fleet constantly shifts the registration between countries with notoriously lax maritime enforcement, nations like Belize, Palau, or Cameroon.
But the intelligence sources for today highlight a scenario that pushes this to the absolute extreme. A ship discovered to be completely stateless. It was broadcasting that it was flying the flag of Guyana, but upon investigation, the government of Guyana confirmed they had never registered the vessel.
And the implications of a stateless vessel are terrifying. The oceans are governed by a complex web of international treaties. If a 25-year-old stateless, uninsured supertanker suffers a structural failure and causes a massive oil spill in the Arabian Sea, there is no international insurance conglomerate to underwrite the multi-billion-dollar environmental cleanup.
And there is no flag state to hold legally or financially accountable. The environmental risk to coastal ecosystems is incalculable.
And the geopolitical reality surrounding this fleet is deeply paradoxical. The very sanctions designed to restrict capital to certain regimes birthed this shadow infrastructure.
Now, it operates with such efficiency that nations who aren't even sanctioned are using it.
Yes. The reports indicate that states like Qatar and the UAE are negotiating bilateral carve-outs, essentially tollgate arrangements with Iranian forces, to allow their own ships to utilize shadow tactics to bypass the conflict.
The UAE reportedly utilized these dark fleet tactics to slip 4 massive tankers carrying 6 million barrels of crude through the strait simply to avoid the crossfire.
And all of these illicit maritime maneuvers directly impact the macroeconomic stability we just discussed. Because India is not a sanctioned state, the Indian commercial fleet does not utilize these dark tactics.
Consequently, the closure of the conventional route forces Indian energy importers to source crude from much further geographic distances, such as the United States Gulf Coast or West Africa.
which drastically increases maritime freight costs and transit times. As noted, the price of Brent crude has surged toward $100 a barrel. The economic modeling is brutal.
Right. Every $10 increase in the price of crude adds roughly 8,000 to 10,000 crore rupees to India's annual energy import bill.
It is a massive involuntary transfer of national wealth, fundamentally driven by obsolete ships turning off their radio tracking beacons to evade the law.
It is a system built entirely on exploiting technological blind spots. But what happens when we flip the script? What happens when we use hyper-advanced, unhackable tracking technology to enforce the rules with absolute mathematical perfection?
Pivoting to sports.
Right, we are moving away from the dark, perilous waters of the Persian Gulf and looking toward the hyper-illuminated, perfectly manicured pitches of the FIFA World Cup.
Yes. We are specifically examining the technological infrastructure of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, which is a massive multinational event jointly hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
And crucially, before we even delve into the technology, we must acknowledge the monumental sporting narrative for India here. For the very first time in the nation's history, the Indian national football team has successfully qualified for the expanded 48-team World Cup tournament.
It's an incredible moment.
It's a watershed moment for Indian athletics, and it's amplified by the incredible storyline that the legendary Sunil Chhetri has officially come out of retirement, specifically to lead the team on this global stage.
The cultural impact of India's qualification is massive.
Absolutely.
However, the technological narrative of this specific tournament is equally groundbreaking, and it centers entirely on the official match ball. FIFA has partnered with Adidas to introduce the Fusbalib Evo, also known as the Al Hilm.
And this is not merely a stitched sphere of synthetic leather. It is a highly sophisticated piece of artificial intelligence hardware.
It is. The engineering inside this ball is fascinating. Suspended precisely in the absolute dead center of the football, held in place by a specialized tension system, is an inertial measurement unit, an IMU.
This sensor package contains microscopic accelerometers and gyroscopes.
Yes. It is continuously measuring the ball's exact acceleration, its rate of rotation, its spin axis, and its precise physical location in three-dimensional space.
And it is recording this data at an astonishing rate of 500 times every single second.
500 hertz.
Right.
And capturing that data is only half the engineering challenge. Transmitting it in real time from a ball being kicked at 100 kilometers an hour is the other.
Why does it do that?
The IMU transmits this continuous stream of data wirelessly using ultra-wideband, or UWB, communication technology to a highly calibrated network of receiving antennas positioned strategically around the perimeter of the stadium.
UWB is crucial here because it operates at very high frequencies, providing centimeter-level spatial accuracy with a data latency of less than 10 milliseconds.
Exactly. So the stadium's central computer network knows the exact orientation, velocity, and location of the ball instantly, without any perceptible delay.
How does this hyper-accurate data stream actually alter the mechanics of refereeing the game?
It fundamentally revolutionizes the semi-automated offside technology, the SAOT, and the broader video assistant referee, or VAR, system.
Because before, VAR relied entirely on high-speed optical cameras to track the players and the ball.
Right. But cameras are limited by frame rates. Even high-speed broadcast cameras might only capture 50 or 60 frames per second. If a player kicks the ball in the microsecond between two camera frames, the computer algorithm had to artificially estimate or interpolate the exact moment of contact based on motion blur.
And that estimation introduced a margin of algorithmic error.
Exactly. And when you are attempting to adjudicate an offside decision that comes down to a margin of millimeters, algorithmic error renders the entire technological pursuit meaningless.
So the AI ball eliminates that temporal error entirely.
Because the internal IMU is sensing physical acceleration 500 times a second, it records the exact, undeniable microsecond the kicker's boot deforms the surface of the ball.
You take that hyper-precise, unarguable timestamp from the ball, and you synchronize it with the stadium's optical camera network,
which is simultaneously tracking 29 distinct skeletal data points on the body of every single player on the pitch.
The fusion of these two datasets allows the AI to render instant, mathematically perfect offside decisions. Furthermore, it completely eliminates the controversy of phantom goals, because the ball itself knows precisely when its entire circumference has crossed the goal line.
It can also analyze the exact velocity and angle of a deflection to determine if a handball was deliberate or incidental.
The sheer volume of data being generated is unprecedented in sports history. You have 29 biometric tracking points per player, multiplied by 22 players, plus 500 data points per second broadcasting from the ball itself.
It creates the richest, most dense real-time data set ever collected during a live sporting event.
Which inevitably raises massive, unresolved governance and privacy questions. Who legally owns this biometric and performance data? Does FIFA retain the rights? Do the individual clubs? Or do the players themselves own the mathematical representation of their physical exertion?
It is a vast legal frontier. Data protection frameworks, particularly regarding biometric data, are going to be severely tested by this technology. We have seen precursor technologies like the Hawkeye system and the decision review system, the DRS, heavily utilized in cricket, but the continuous invasive nature of tracking 29 skeletal points in real time elevates the privacy concerns to an entirely new level.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, though. If the AI ball calls an offside by exactly 1.5 centimeters, something no human eye could ever see, are we sacrificing the emotional spirit of the sport at the altar of mathematical perfection? Does a game lose its fundamental soul when we systematically engineer human error out of its administration?
That debate touches the very core of why we consume sports. We demand fairness, but we also crave the uninterrupted, organic flow of human endeavor and the drama of imperfection.
Right.
However, when we step back, we have to acknowledge that perfect fairness in a game, debating the philosophical purity of millimeter offside calls, is a profound luxury.
Yeah, that's true.
It exists only because a football pitch is a highly controlled artificial environment. In the actual world, outside the stadium walls, our legal and social systems struggle violently to provide even the most basic, fundamental fairness and protection to the most vulnerable members of society.
Which brings us to a transition that is as stark as it is absolutely necessary. From the pursuit of artificial mathematical fairness in a game, we must examine the pursuit of basic constitutional human dignity in reality.
The Supreme Court of India has just forcefully intervened to completely rewrite the national rulebook on how the state protects and rehabilitates survivors of human trafficking.
We are analyzing a monumental landmark judgment delivered on May 29, 2026 by a Supreme Court bench comprising Justice J.B. Pardawala and Justice R. Mahadevan.
The case is formally cited as Prajwala v. Union of India. Prajwala is a highly respected, internationally recognized non-governmental organization based in Hyderabad that has been on the front lines fighting commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking since 1996.
They initiated this public interest litigation over a decade ago, back in 2015.
The duration of this legal battle is staggering, and the ruling they have finally secured is universally being hailed as the most comprehensive, detailed anti-trafficking directive in the history of Indian jurisprudence.
During the proceedings, Justice Pardawala made a statement from the bench that is incredibly telling. He noted, and I quote, "It took a pretty long time to prepare this judgment, but we are sure you won't have to refer to any books henceforth on the subject."
That is an assertion of absolute legal finality.
It is a statement that reflects the sweeping, almost legislative nature of the judgment. To comprehend why the Supreme Court felt compelled to go to such extraordinary lengths, you must understand the profound legislative vacuum that existed in India regarding human trafficking.
The statutory framework was a fragmented, archaic mess. The primary legislation was the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, the ITPA of 1956.
And this was a deeply flawed piece of legislation because its historical focus was on public morality rather than human exploitation, right?
Yes, it frequently resulted in the criminalization and harassment of the sex workers themselves, rather than aggressively targeting the organized transnational trafficking syndicates.
There were other scattered provisions across the Indian Penal Code, the POCSO Act for the Protection of Children, and the Juvenile Justice Act, but there was no unified, modern framework.
And it wasn't for a lack of recognition. The parliament attempted to rectify this. They drafted and actually passed a comprehensive anti-trafficking bill in the Lok Sabha in 2018, but it languished and ultimately lapsed in the Rajya Sabha.
They attempted another comprehensive draft in 2021, but it failed to advance again.
The legislative branch repeatedly stalled. The Supreme Court's judgment essentially declared that its patience with the executive and legislative branch's decade-long delay had completely evaporated.
Consequently, the court did not merely issue guidelines or suggestions. They invoked their extraordinary plenary powers under Article 142 of the Constitution,
which empowers the Supreme Court to pass any decree necessary for doing complete justice in any cause or matter.
right, in conjunction with their powers under Article 32, to issue binding, legally enforceable directions to all states and union territories. This is a rare, aggressive exercise of judicial legislation. The court forcefully willed a national protective framework into existence.
Let's examine the mechanics of this framework, because the court mandated a meticulously detailed 6-stage victim protection plan.
Okay, stage 1 is pre-rescue intelligence.
Yes. The court explicitly mandated that law enforcement agencies must gather robust, actionable intelligence before initiating operations. They issued a stern directive that the guise of anti-trafficking operations must never be used to indiscriminately raid establishments or harass consenting adults engaged in sex work.
Stage 2 governs the rescue phase itself. The court mandated a paradigm shift toward a trauma-informed approach.
The absolute foundational philosophy dictated by the bench is that rescued individuals are victims of severe exploitation and violence. They are survivors, and under no circumstances are they to be treated as criminals or suspects subject to arrest.
Which flows directly into the critical mandates of Stage 3, immediate post-rescue.
Upon extraction from the exploitative environment, survivors must immediately receive specialized medical care, psychological first aid, and comprehensive legal aid provided in a language they actually comprehend.
And in a massive departure from past practices, the court strictly ordered that survivors must not be involuntarily detained in state shelter homes as if they are serving a prison sentence.
Then we arrive at stage 4, rehabilitation. From a constitutional perspective, this is arguably the most radical and significant component of the entire judgment.
The Supreme Court unequivocally ruled that the rehabilitation of a trafficking survivor is not merely an optional policy choice, a welfare scheme, or a charitable endeavor by the government.
Right. The court elevated rehabilitation to the status of a fundamental constitutional right inextricably grounded in Article 21, the right to life and personal liberty.
The court mandated that rehabilitation must encompass continuing education, viable vocational training, and sustained financial support. The court explicitly said rehabilitation isn't a policy choice. It's a fundamental right under Article 21. Does this mean a survivor could now theoretically sue the state government if they failed to provide vocational training or financial support?
That is precisely the legal avenue this judgment opens. By declaring rehabilitation a fundamental right under Article 21, it becomes fully justiciable. The state architecture is no longer merely obligated to attempt rehabilitation. They can be held strictly, legally accountable in a court of law for failing to execute it.
Moving to the latter stages, Stage 5 mandates reintegration.
The state is directed to facilitate family reintegration only in circumstances where comprehensive assessments determine it is physically and psychologically safe for the survivor to return, and it mandates active community sensitization programs to shield survivors from societal stigma.
Finally, Stage 6 addresses prosecution. The court ordered the establishment of fast-track courts, specifically dedicated to trafficking cases.
To prevent re-traumatization during the judicial process, they mandated that victim testimony must be facilitated utilizing protective screens or remote video links.
Furthermore, they aggressively enforced the survivor's right to financial compensation under Section 357A of the Code of Criminal Procedure, now transitioning to the BNSS, ensuring the state legal services authorities disperse funds regardless of whether the trafficker is successfully convicted.
It represents a monumental, seismic shift in human rights jurisprudence. The Supreme Court had to forcefully drag national policy into the modern era, utilizing the heaviest constitutional hammers at its disposal to compel a reluctant state apparatus to center the dignity of the survivor.
It is a profound example of a system, the judicial system, reacting to decades of legislative stress and failure by fundamentally rewriting its own operational rules. But in our eighth and final topic for today's deep dive, we observe a completely different dynamic regarding state action.
Right, totally different.
We are not looking at a court coercing a reluctant government to act. We're looking at a state government aggressively leaping into the future, creating a massive new policy framework to attract the most power-hungry technology on Earth.
We are pivoting back toward the intersection of technology, infrastructure, and economics, focusing on the state of Andhra Pradesh.
In April 2026, the AP state government issued Government Order Mrs. No. 32. This is a landmark, highly aggressive policy directive that essentially rewrites the foundational rules of electricity distribution to accommodate the incoming artificial intelligence revolution.
And the core mechanism of this policy is unprecedented. Andhra Pradesh is legally permitting mega data centers, specifically defining those with an astronomical continuous power demand exceeding 300 megawatts, to obtain a status known as a deemed distribution licensee, or DDL, under the framework of the National Electricity Act of 2003.
To grasp why this is so revolutionary, you must understand the traditional architecture of the Indian power sector. Historically, any industrial consumer, whether it's an automobile factory or a standard data center, is legally mandated to purchase its electricity from the local state-run distribution company, known as the DISCOM.
Exactly. The DISCOM holds a monopoly over the physical grid in that region.
However, granting DDL status completely shatters that monopoly. It legally empowers these mega data centers to construct, own, and operate their own internal, localized electricity distribution infrastructure.
They are permitted to completely bypass the state DISCOM, enter the open energy market directly, and purchase power straight from independent renewable energy producers or national power exchanges.
And the economic scale of the corporations utilizing this new framework is staggering. Google has just officially received the very first private power distribution license for a data center in India under this specific AP policy.
They're leveraging this to construct a massive $15 billion AI hub and data center cluster in the coastal city of Visakhapatnam.
Reliance Industries is actively developing an $11 billion facility, and RMZ Corp is in the planning stages for a $35 billion campus with a mind-boggling 1.5 gigawatt capacity, all congregating within the Vizag ecosystem.
The concentration in Visakhapatnam is highly strategic. Vizag serves as a critical landing point for major international submarine fiber optic internet cables, providing the vital international data backbone.
It possesses expansive tracts of industrial land, deep water port connectivity for importing heavy server infrastructure, and crucial geographic proximity to Andhra Pradesh's massive expanding solar and wind energy parks.
The state government has set an incredibly aggressive target. They want to establish 6,000 megawatts of data center capacity by 2030, aiming to position Andhra Pradesh as the undisputed AI capital of the Global South.
But to understand the necessity of this policy, we have to talk about the absolute, insatiable hunger of artificial intelligence. Training massive AI architectures, specifically large language models, requires an astronomical, almost incomprehensible volume of uninterrupted electricity.
We are not talking about standard server racks. We are talking about tens of thousands of high-performance GPUs running at maximum capacity 24 hours a day, generating immense heat that requires equally massive liquid cooling infrastructure.
Current industry estimates project that India's overall power demand just for data centers will skyrocket to 13.5 gigawatts by 2030, up from a mere 1.5 gigawatts today.
And those AI training models are hypersensitive. A microsecond voltage fluctuation on the grid can corrupt days of computational training, costing millions of dollars.
A standard, publicly operated state DISCOM in India chronically struggles with voltage stability and load balancing. They simply cannot build out high-voltage transmission capacity fast enough to accommodate a sudden, localized demand spike of 300 megawatts.
But crucially, the primary motivation here is economic. State DISCOMs force commercial and industrial users to pay massive cross-subsidy surcharges.
They intentionally charge factories and data centers a steep premium so they can artificially subsidize and provide cheap or entirely free electricity to agricultural pumps and low-income residential households.
Consequently, drawing power from the state grid usually costs a data center anywhere from 7 to 10 rupees per unit.
By securing this DDL status and completely bypassing the state DISCOM, these tech giants legally evade those cross-subsidy charges entirely.
When you combine that avoidance with Andhra Pradesh's additional policy sweeteners, which include total exemptions on state electricity duties and transmission charges for a period of 15 to 20 years, these corporations can effectively drive their operational power costs down to just 3 to 4 rupees a unit.
Over a 20-year horizon, that represents billions of dollars in savings. The policy also mandates that at least 51% of the power they procure must be sourced from renewable energy, which aligns neatly with both corporate ESG goals and India's sovereign carbon reduction commitments.
Yes, but we need to critically examine the systemic fallout of this policy.
This is basically cord-cutting for heavy industries. But if the biggest, wealthiest consumers like Google and Reliance opt out of the state grid, doesn't that leave the state DISCOM bankrupt and force the poorest citizens to shoulder the cost of the grid?
That is the profound, perhaps existential structural risk embedded in this policy. It fundamentally reshapes the economics of Indian infrastructure and federalism.
While the Electricity Act of 2003 technically contains provisions for parallel distribution licenses under Section 14, Andhra Pradesh is the first state to successfully operationalize it at this massive industrial scale.
If the state discoms lose their highest-paying commercial tier, the entire cross-subsidy economic model that sustains rural electrification collapses.
Yet the competitive pressure is immense. Other heavily industrialized states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu will almost certainly be forced to replicate AP's policy simply to remain competitive and attract the billions of dollars of foreign AI investment.
This implies that the revenue crisis for state power grids is destined to become a severe national issue. Visakhapatnam, with its submarine cables and renewable access, is positioning itself as the AI capital of the global south, but at what cost?
It represents a fascinating, highly consequential societal trade-off. A state government is consciously deciding to sacrifice the traditional revenue model and stability of its public utility grid in order to win the global high-stakes race for artificial intelligence infrastructure.
It is the ultimate manifestation of a system under stress. You are trading local, equitable grid stability for global technological and economic dominance in the 21st century.
Looking at the depth of the material we've unpacked, that brings us to the conclusion of our stack of sources for today. Let's briefly recap the massive intellectual journey we've taken. We began by analyzing the macro engine of the nation, unpacking MOSPI's methodology to understand how India's economy achieved a robust 7.7% growth, driven by a dominant services sector and a resurgent manufacturing base.
We then exposed the profoundly fragile underbelly of the digital infrastructure enabling that growth, detailing how a 19-year-old researcher's discovery of catastrophic cloud security flaws at the CBSE highlights the critical, urgent need for public bug bounty programs and rigorous vendor accountability.
We scrutinized the deeply entrenched, toxic political culture of West Bengal, examining a historical party panchayat fusion that treats democratic elections as existential warfare, and explored the constitutional limitations, specifically the Bombay judgment, that restrict the center's ability to intervene.
We observed the Reserve Bank of India navigating a precarious tightrope, holding the repo rate at 5.25% as they manage a stagflation dilemma exacerbated by a vulnerable rupee and global energy shocks.
We journeyed into the perilous waters of the Strait of Hormuz, analyzing the mechanics of the 978-strong shadow fleet, utilizing AI spoofing, ship-to-ship transfers, and flag hopping to launder sanctioned crude oil, ultimately driving up India's macroeconomic import bills.
We transitioned to the hyperlit stadiums of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, where an AI-enabled football pulsing data at 500 Hz promises to eliminate human algorithmic error from refereeing, fundamentally altering the philosophical nature of the sport while raising massive data privacy questions.
We examined the Supreme Court's landmark judicial intervention regarding human trafficking, utilizing extraordinary constitutional powers to mandate a trauma-informed, 6-stage victim protection plan that elevates survivor rehabilitation to a fully justiciable, fundamental human right under Article 21.
And finally, we analyzed Andhra Pradesh aggressively rewriting the foundational rules of the energy sector, permitting mega data centers to legally bypass the state electrical grid to feed the insatiable multi-gigawatt power demands of the artificial intelligence revolution.
8 distinct narratives. But as we established at the outset, they represent one unified theme. Complex systems, whether they are legal, digital, economic, or physical, reacting to immense stress, vulnerability, and rapid, uncompromising evolution.
Truly fascinating.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a concept to ponder that synthesizes a few of the massive global shifts we've explored today. We talked about the shadow fleet evading nation-states on the oceans, and we talked about data centers building their own private electrical grids. Right. As AI corporations become wealthier and consume more resources than some countries, will we see the rise of shadow grids? Sovereign corporate enclaves, powered by their own energy, operating entirely outside the traditional infrastructure of the nation-state. Something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, critically examine the systems that govern your world, and stay well informed.